Hello. Can you hear me now? I hope this thing is working. Yeah. Oh, there you are. All right. Do you like my surprised expression? Here's sad. We can also do happy, angry, happy-ish, content. I don't know. I think this is content. Well, welcome everyone. All one of you that's here. I don't know how many people are actually watching this. Oh, Vix. Hey. Hey, Vix. How you doing? Welcome. Tonight we'll be talking about Japan and running some tests. Feel free to listen to me, watch me occasionally while you watch Xeons draw art as well. Hello, Bumble. Welcome. For those who don't know me, I think everyone here knows me, but my name is Catherine. I am part of Tifei's Luna community. I am Dapper Deputy's mod, one of his mods. I think I can say, you know, his preferred mod, his favorite mod. And I won't tell Xeons that. And Tifei would do that. I'm paying him to promote me. So I go by Professor Red Wolf here as my VTuber, educational professor person. I'm going to be talking about Japan. So one of the issues, of course, is like when you're going to be like, I want to talk about an entire country for all time. You know, that's kind of difficult to approach that kind of thing. Like, I'm going to talk about the entire history of the United States and its art and its culture and its people, and that would be really daunting. So for Japan, I have taught Japanese visual culture in the past, and the way that I approached it was as if we were gonna travel through Japan, basically armchair traveling. So I have a lot of like art history books on Japan, but oftentimes those are very dense and dry texts. So unless you're super excited about art history, sometimes they're difficult to read. So what I do is I combine those with travel guides as well as, you know, pop culture texts and different things like that. So we have history, art history, pop cultural history, as well as travel guides, in order to make it a bit more interesting. So essentially together we pretend that we're traveling through Japan and we learn about it together. Some of you know a lot about Japan already. You know more than me. So feel free to like speak up in the chat if you have things to add or you want to tell me I'm wrong about something. You know, I am using books and resources, and sometimes books and resources are inaccurate. Humans make them, and humans make mistakes. So feel free to correct me or speak up on any topic that you want to contribute to as I move forward. So instead of being like, I'm going to talk about the entirety of the history of Japan today, you know, and we all fall asleep, I'm taking a slightly different starting point, particularly because I'm not sure about the technical aspects of this. You know, I've done some tests of the streams, and I've dropped a lot of frames. That's a sort of disaster. So who knows how the quality of this will go, if it holds up. If I drop frames or I start looking like a jerky puppet or you can't hear me, feel free to let me know, because this is really my first stream ever. Dun dun dun. So for today's presentation, we're going to focus on the beginning of this book here. This is the 2019 Lonely Planet Guide to Japan. It is, a convenient price of basically $30. You can get the ebook slightly cheaper, or you can buy specific chapters. But it is 1,000 pages of really small text. So most of you are probably not going to sit down and read 1,000 pages of really small text just for fun. So what I do in these types of presentations and in my courses in the past is I sort of digest that information for you. I bring in a lot of pictures and I talk about the stuff that's in these types of guides in a more casual way, so you don't have to sit down with the 1,000-page book, which is very daunting. Alright, so this is one of the guides that I use. I have several other guides, but this is the one that we're going to start with today. Alright, let's see if I can click through my PDF without crashing the entire system. Look at that. Look at that. I didn't break it. Okay. Alright, so first we're going to start with a map. And, it's an important point that I'm going to make is that I'm going to assume anyone here, obviously a lot of you know about a lot about Japan, but I'm sort of assuming that no one knows anything when I talk about it. So, essentially, we're going to start from the basics. So this is how it looks today, and it has 4 main islands. So you have Hokkaido up here. We have Honshu, which is this long main island, the large island. And we have Shikoku, which is this little one here, and Kyushu down here. So these are the 4 main islands of Japan, except, well, my mouse stopped moving. There we go. These are the 4 main islands of Japan, but there are almost 7,000 islands to the archipelago of Japan. So I'm going to talk a lot more about, the geography of Japan in further lectures, but I just wanted people to sort of be able to geographically place Japan. So over here we see Shanghai, which is obviously China. So China is very close. And then we have South Korea, North Korea, and then when we see these cities over here and moving upwards, and then there's this island here, which is called Sakhalin, and that is part of Russia. So like literally Russia is like almost touching Hokkaido, and of course Seoul here, and South Korea almost touching Japan here. So it's very close to several countries, several very important countries. And then we have the Sea of Japan in the middle of all of that. And it of course is the sort of stopping point for a lot of migrations of people who are coming from the mainland, coming from the north southward, and hitting into the Japanese islands, and then there's like really no place else to go, right, until you get boats and ships and planes and things like that and can actually go farther across the Pacific Ocean. So we're going to talk a little bit more in further lectures about, the geography of Japan and how that... Ooh, I'm stuck. There we go. There we go. There we go. The geography of Japan and how that affects the history of Japan as well. So then moving on, here we go. So basically I'm just going to go through these like introductory topics that Lonely Planet presents as like reasons for you to go to Japan and things that you're going to learn about in this guidebook. And the first one that it presents is... Ooh, I'm stuck. Watch my avatar get stuck. The first one it presents is Kyoto as one of the highlights of Japan. And Kyoto is known for many, many temples. It has thousands of temples. There's really thousands of temples and shrines throughout all of Japan. But Kyoto is a really important religious center. Here we have the Kinkakuji Temple. Again, I really don't know Japanese that well, so I'm gonna butcher the language. I'm gonna try, but if I really kill something in my pronunciation, feel free to let me know. And this is the Golden Pavilion. So essentially, it is a temple in Kyoto, Japan, which is entirely covered in gold leaf, essentially. And it is just one of many examples in Kyoto. And unlike many other cities, Japanese cities during World War II, it was not bombed by the Allied military forces. So most of the bombing was carried out by the United States, and many, many Japanese cities were firebombed. And then, of course, we know about the atomic bombs as well. But because of Kyoto's religious significance to the Japanese people, it was not bombed. So a lot of the original structures for the temples and shrines still exist today. So we have a lot to look at in Kyoto, including this temple here. And again, I'm just sort of giving you an idea of the types of things that we'll be talking about in my presentations. As my head flaps around. There we go. Alright, so another thing to look forward to in Japan, learning about, is onsen, which is hot springs. Stuck again. Japan is basically the most active volcanic area in the world. There are still many, many active volcanoes currently on the islands, and there is very frequent earthquakes. There's about 1,000 earthquakes a year that humans can actually feel. There's a lot more earthquakes that happen that we can't feel happening. And there's a lot of things like hot springs, volcanic activity, making very, very hot water throughout the islands. And the hot springs are called onsen. And here we have an example of a hot spring that has been created for the capybara of a zoo. I think there's about 3 to 4 zoos in Japan that have these type of onsen for the capybara. Capybara are tropical animals. They're not native to Japan. So in order to help them through the winters, they have built them hot springs to soak in every day, and you can go watch them climb into their personal onsens and bathe. So using hot springs is a really important social and cultural aspect of Japanese life. They are located throughout all the islands, except some of the southern ones don't have the same type of hot springs available. But you're going to find them everywhere, and they're very important for Japanese culture. So we're going to talk more about specific onsen, the rules of going into an onsen, how do you actually, bathe in them, that kind of stuff, those types of things. We're going to talk about those throughout the class, throughout my presentations as well. And of course, capybara. We'll talk more about capybara as well. So Japanese cuisine. Japan is obviously well known for its cuisine, so we're going to talk a lot about cuisine that was invented in Japan, some things that had Western influence, and as well as specific seasonal and regional dishes. A lot of Japanese cuisine is based around what is available in the season. They like fresh ingredients. So you get seasonal dishes that you won't be able to get at other times of the year. And the same thing with regional dishes. Most of the regions in Japan, they put a lot of care into creating things that you can only find in this one region, this one prefecture, this one town, because they want to attract customers. They want to attract, both Japanese people and foreign tourists as well. So they want to offer unique regional dishes that are special. This is a type of udon. There are many different types of udon available, but this is one called Sanuki udon, which is, I believe, I can't remember which city it's. The city just ran out of my head right now, but it is a specific square type of udon that you can find in this one region. So we'll talk more about cuisine throughout my presentations. All right. Moving on, we'll talk about ryokan. Ryokan are Japanese style, basically, inns. It's kind of the word for inn. There are Western style hotels also available throughout Japan, but the ryokan are what you're going to find, more frequently, especially in rural areas. You will still find Western hotels in some areas that are very trendy tourist areas. You'll find hostels, you'll find guest houses, but ryokan are sort of the most famous place to go stay in Japan if you want the so-called, authentic Japanese experience. And most of these places will have, special meal courses when you stay there that are often specific to the inn. And some of these ryokan also have the onsen hot springs built into their facilities. So you can see that the foods are amazing, yes. Most people, if you're not allergic to things that they're served in Japan, a lot of people go and they go on a vacation where they're going to eat everything as you go. It's very important. As a local and as a tourist, food is often a number one attraction. So this is an example of the type of, ryokan where you have a garden inside, Japanese architecture, particularly traditional architecture, is very concerned about bringing the outside inside and the inside outside. So there's a lot of care for, how the view looks out of your window. What does the courtyard look like? All of those types of things. They're very interested in, aesthetically pleasing settings. So when you go to a ryokan, as most Asian, settings, you're not going to wear your shoes inside. Most people know this, but when you come into this type of inn, you're going to have slippers like you see here, so you leave your shoes at the door. There's usually sometimes cubbies, and you wear slippers throughout the establishment. And then later on, let's see, you're going to get your personal room, and you see on the floor there are tatami mats, so they're woven mats, and you're not going to wear slippers on the mats either, because they are, they're delicate. You don't want to walk all over those things, and somebody has to make new ones when you wear it down. So unlike Western hotels that have, the traditional kind of bed that most people probably sleep in here in the United States and other westernized countries, here in the traditional Japanese ryokan, you sleep on futons, which are these roll-out mattresses that go directly onto the tatami mats. So, if you are going to Japan and you definitely need a bed to sleep on for, your own personal reasons, whatever that may be, you're not going to want to go and stay at a ryokan because you're going to be getting these futon roll-out mattresses. So we'll talk more about, what's it like to stay at these places. Some of the more unique ones around the country, some of them have, really important histories. And then we'll talk about Japanese architecture as well during the presentations. And obviously, ryokan are great examples of traditional Japanese architecture. So they're important to study in a variety of different ways, from social practices, etiquette, cuisine, architecture, all sorts of things are connected to these inns. All right, so another place that we're going to be talking about besides Kyoto is Tokyo. Tokyo is, of course, the major city of Japan. It was an imperial, well, it still is the imperial capital, essentially. Nara was an imperial capital. Kyoto was an imperial capital. And eventually it moved to Tokyo. And when it moved here to Tokyo, it was called Edo. And that was the beginning of the Edo period. So here we have Akihabara. I'm going to trip on that word, which is one of the most famous neighborhoods in Tokyo for its sort of otaku culture center, where you find a lot of comic book stores and toy stores and different things like that. So we're going to be talking about the history of Tokyo in this course. Where did it come from? How did it start? And how did it become the most densely populated city in the world once upon a time? It is still incredibly densely populated. And we'll talk about, major historic events that took place there, including the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and the firebombing of Tokyo during World War II, of course. Lots of important events, and as well as sad events took place here. And of course, today it is a bustling center of, modernity, modern life, lots of flashy things happening, neon lights, that kind of stuff, as well as a lot of, very old historical, important sites as well. So we'll try to go through the neighborhoods, major sites, activities, recreation, shopping, restaurants, that kind of stuff. So we'll kind of dip in and out of Tokyo throughout the presentations. All right. So another thing that this book brings up is how do I pronounce it? Good question. There we go. Daibutsu. The Great Buddha of Nara. So this is, one of the largest bronze cast statues of Buddha in the world. That is what you're looking at now. So of course I've talked about art history as being an important component of the course. So as we travel along to locations, we'll talk about sculptures, paintings, different types of artifacts that we find along the way. So some of them are basically, functioning, living pieces of art, like this great Buddha. He, lives in his temple. You can go visit him. This is an example of their cleanings, their basically ritual that they do in order to spruce him up and dust him off. So some of these things are being used, in everyday life today. And then, of course, we have museums that store a lot of artifacts and artwork. So we'll talk about some of those things as well. And Japan has a whole system called important cultural properties. So items that are particularly special, meaningful, historical, valuable, particularly maybe for religious reasons even, they get this important cultural property status. So we'll talk about a lot of those types of things. So if you ever go and you see these things in the museums, you will, or even in temples, some of these things are in temples and shrines still, you'll be a little bit more familiar with what these things are. So there is Buddha, and this is the house he lives in. So this is Todaiji Temple, and it is in Nara. As I said, that big Buddha is in Nara, and it was an important center of Buddhist studies, and lots of monasteries, Buddhist monasteries are here. And one of the reasons why the imperial capital was moved to Kyoto was because the Buddhist sects here in Nara were becoming too powerful. They had too much power, too much political power, even though they're religious. Oftentimes religion and politics are very closely related in Japan. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, and I'll get into that in the course. I apologize in advance if you hear my dog whining, because I can never do anything without the dog whining in the background. So this is one of the largest, oldest wooden structures in the world here, which is where Buddha lives, and you can visit him at Todaiji in Nara. All right. So another important thing about Japanese culture is the focus on the seasons as well as nature. So they're very interested in trees, flowers, birds, all different kinds of wildlife. They're very interested even in the mountains, the hills, everything. And this is Hanami, which is picnicking underneath the cherry blossoms. So cherry blossoms are, an important part of Japanese culture. Every year there's this wave of cherry blossoms that the trees flower, moving up the archipelago of Japan. As the temperature warms in the spring, the trees will flower, and the flowers don't last that long. They maybe last a week to 2 weeks. So it's kind of this ethereal, kind of ephemeral event that the Japanese like to celebrate. And you can enjoy them by taking strolls in the parks where the cherry trees are, or you can have these picnics, the Hanami picnics. And usually, in the past, I'm not sure how it goes during pandemic times, but in the past they get really crowded, so a lot of times people show up really early and they set out little mats, and they claim their picnic spot ahead of time, and then they'll have these really elaborate setups, as you can see in this picture here, for dining underneath the cherry blossoms. So if you want to visit Japan during cherry blossom season, obviously you're going to have to time it pretty carefully. And of course you're going to come into it's going to be very busy. You're not the only person there who wants to see the cherry blossoms. You're going to have a lot of locals also wanting to see the cherry blossoms. So book far in advance, and take time to reserve your spot for your picnic ahead of time and that kind of stuff. But very important part of Japanese culture, and we'll talk more about cherry blossoms, Hanami. We'll talk more about enjoying the outdoors in many different ways, and the importance of the seasons for Japanese culture, poetry, literature, the arts. All of those things often cycle back to meanings that can be found in the seasons and the changing of the seasons, different flowers and birds and things that you find in the seasons. So we have, a lot of traditional Japanese art. We have ancient Japanese art that we're going to talk about, traditional Japanese art and paintings. And then we have, modern and contemporary Japanese art. And one of the places where it's currently being sort of celebrated, contemporary Japanese art, is the island of Naoshima. It was basically like a fishing village island. The population was dwindling. And of course, the population of all of Japan is currently dwindling, and we'll talk more about that in the presentations and why that's happening, and what what changes may need to happen because of the population changes. But Naoshima, several people became very interested in establishing it as a contemporary art mecca, essentially. So they made museums, they made art installations, they made onsen that are contemporary art installations, and we have Yayoi Kusuma, I can't say the word right now, Kusama's pumpkin sculpture. She is famous for her sculptures, these pumpkin sculptures. So this is an example of a contemporary art installation, which is right on the bay in Naoshima. And you'll find these things throughout the island, and special, local homes have been transformed into art installations. And once this kind of wave started to happen, you started to get more inns in the area, you started to get more restaurants. So some of that type of activity is helping these areas that are like losing populations gain economic stability again. So we'll talk about Naoshima more, contemporary art more, and of course, as I said, population changes in Japan. There are even some areas of Japan that are basically going back to the wild. Some cities they've lost so many people that they're, demolishing houses, they're demolishing roads, they're letting the forest take back over certain areas. Meanwhile, Tokyo is still bustling, of course, but, the population is dwindling in a lot of areas. So we'll talk more about that. So we have, the Buddhist religion in Japan. We had some Christianity that showed up, which was heavily persecuted. So there's not a lot of Japanese Christians today for various reasons that we will get into the history of that. But Buddhism came over from China, and it became very popular, and it sort of fused with the religion that already existed in Japan, which is called Shinto. So Shinto and Buddhism coexisted, so a lot of times you get one religion coming into an area, throughout world history, and it kind of stamps out the religion that was already here. In Japan, that is not the case. They sort of fuse together in a lot of ways. So you'll see, Shinto shrines right next to Buddhist temples, and there's some, sections of Buddhist belief, because there's different types of Buddhist beliefs. Some of them essentially adopted all of the Shinto gods, which are called kami, as part of the Buddhist system. So they're like, oh, okay, you have these kami gods. They're actually just all related to the Buddhist system, so we don't have to eliminate the kami. They're just all part of this Buddhist system too. So one of the interesting things about Japan, there was a certain time period, there are certain time periods throughout the history of Japan where you needed special permission to travel. You needed to have a legitimate reason to travel. You needed special government permission to travel. A lot of restrictions were in place. But if you were a religious pilgrim, or studying religion, you were going to be a monk or something like that, or a priest, or you were, like I said, going on a pilgrimage. This was one of the ways that people were allowed to travel throughout Japan. So that's another one of the reasons why we have so many shrines and temples in Japan, because this is how people would travel. They would go from shrine to shrine during these pilgrimages. And some of them are quite arduous, and they were meant to be kind of contemplative and meditative practices where you were, thinking about life, big meaning of life stuff when you're going on these hikes. So this is an example of a Shinto shrine, and you can sort of identify Shinto shrines. I can't talk because the words are too close together. By the torii gates. We'll talk more about, what are torii. This is a torii here. This is basically a gateway to a sacred area, a spiritual realm of a Shinto kami. These are Shrines are basically where the kami are supposed to live. So that's marking the transition from, your everyday world into a sacred area. So we'll talk more about, what is Shinto? What does that actually mean? We'll talk about, ancient Japanese mythology, creation myths. We'll talk about the kami in relation to that. And we'll also talk about, Japanese folklore and folk beliefs and things like the yokai, which are kind of like a variety of creatures, ghosts, demons, different things like that, that are, sort of folk beliefs. So we'll talk about that as well. And, as I said, you have a lot of, very special hikes and trails and pathways and things like that you can find throughout Japan. These things exist for a variety of reasons, but they're very popular locations to go to today. So we'll talk about some of the major ones, and the most important forests, the most important mountains, and things like that. The most important pilgrimage sites. Including, this is one such village, Tsumago, I believe is, if I'm remembering the name right. So we have a lot of like postal roads and imperial roads that were established during certain history points in Japan, and this is basically how the post would travel. So you had postal roads that would move the post along, and of course along those roads you would have inns and restaurants and different things, offered for the travelers along these postal roads. So you have some of these towns still existing today, of course. And there was, once upon a time, a rule where the major families had to go live in Edo for certain parts of the year. So you had these huge entourages which were traveling this highway system from, perhaps rural land holdings, traveling across the country to stay for part of the year in the imperial capital. And that practice existed for, several political reasons, economic reasons, but it encouraged the growth of this highway system and, these little towns along these highway systems. So we'll talk about some of the things that still exist today and the importance of that system, and a lot of the art and poetry and things like that were created in relation to these road networks. So we'll talk about, of course, a lot of different sites, as I said, mountains and volcanoes and things like that. This is Mount Fuji. It is regarded as a god, and that's one of the important things about the Shinto kami system to remember, is that like a tree can be a god, a rock can be a god, a volcano can be a god, this forest can be a god, that kind of thing. There isn't like a very strict system for what can and cannot be a god. Emperors are believed to be descended from gods, so they themselves are gods. And then a lot of important historical figures throughout Japanese history, when they died, they became gods, that kind of belief. So Mount Fuji is the highest point in Japan. It is regarded as, a sacred place. It's a popular hiking spot. Of course, a lot of people have a pilgrimage where they go up to the top of it. It is still an active volcano, but it hasn't had any activity since 1707. But it is obviously, an icon of Japan. So we'll talk more about Fuji and the surrounding area, Fujisan and the surrounding area, and how it relates to Shinto and things like that. And of course, we'll talk a lot more about volcanoes and geologic activities. Something else we'll talk about is gardens. Japanese, exterior design is as important as interior design. They want the view outside of their pavilions and houses and temples and shrines to be as aesthetic as possible. There's several different types of garden design, so some of you may think of like a Japanese garden And then you have a Zen garden with like some stones and the sand that's combed around it, So that's one style of Japanese garden, but there are many different types of Japanese gardens. So we'll talk about, garden architecture. And we'll talk about the most famous sites, most famous Japanese gardens throughout the country. So if you have a deep love of gardens, you'll know where to go. You'll know, the most important historical gardens and things like that as well. And we'll talk about sort of the extremes of, the geographic areas. This is Hokkaido. This is the northernmost island of Japan. And a lot of it is still very rural, and they call it like wild Hokkaido. So this is one of the national parks of Japan here. So you still have like a lot of like very rural areas in Hokkaido. So we'll talk about some of those things and sites, activities, things like that are happening in Hokkaido, as well as its historic significance. So we'll talk about a variety of different art forms, So art isn't, when I talk about art, visual culture, art isn't just painting and sculpture. We'll talk about those things as well. We'll talk about the art of calligraphy, things like that, pottery, so on and so forth. But we'll also talk more about, ephemeral arts and things that sort of disappear as soon as they're created, such as, dancing, the tea ceremony, music making. We'll talk about specific Japanese instruments, as well as Japanese games, and things like certain sporting events as well, including sumo. Sumo is an actual, religious sport, essentially. So this is one example of the types of things that we'll be talking about. What is the significance of sumo, and how is it practiced today? How was it practiced in the past? What are these people's what are the wrestlers' lives like? Things like that. We'll also talk about, traditional Japanese archery, sword fighting, things like that. So those are kind of like ephemeral arts in my point of view, because, you perform them and then they kind of go away, right? You see it and then it goes away. It's also kind of a form of theater. There are several types of Japanese theater that we'll talk about, and there's Japanese puppetry as well. So we'll bring up those as well as we go throughout our presentations. And of course, we can't really avoid talking about World War II. And in Japan, it is called the 15 Years War, because it combines, several years of aggression with, China prior to the real beginning of World War II as most Westerners know it. And we'll talk about, the cities of Hiroshima, which you see here in this picture. This is Ground Zero Hiroshima. And Nagasaki, of course, which are the two cities that atomic bombs were dropped on. So we'll talk about, the history of World War II, how Japan was involved in this 15-year war, how it turned into World War II, who were the belligerents and aggressors in all of this, and how did it play out, and how did it end. And of course, one of the major reasons that World War II ended was because those two bombs were dropped. Those bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we'll talk about, not happy things, but how those days played out, and the sort of, the outcomes of those events, and how they still affect Japan and the Japanese people today. And then we'll look at, of course, what do Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like today? What do they offer someone who wants to travel there? Here you see some ruins that are still part of they still stand today in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, and you can see them. So, it's obviously these places look very different today. Some of them are very vibrant cities, so they're interesting places to go visit. And obviously, it's important to sort of know their history when you go there. think that's valuable. So we talked about Hokkaido being sort of the northern island, where we have, lots of snow in the winter. You have ice festivals in Hokkaido. And then all the way you could travel down the tail of Japan. You have, these tropical islands, such as Okinawa. And these were actually part of an entirely different empire until they were, claimed by Japan in the 19th century. And they have a rather interesting history, of being from a different empire, being connected to a variety of other Asian countries, and then they had a rather important role during, World War II, as well as later on during the Vietnam War and the Korean War, which of course Japan was not an aggressor in the Vietnam War nor the Korean War, but it played a very important role through connections with the United States during those wars, and we'll talk about that more. So if you want a tropical paradise to visit, you can go down to Okinawa and a lot of the islands around Okinawa. So you have a variety of different, temperatures that you can experience in Japan. So this is Koyasan. This is specifically the Oko-no-In temple and graveyard of Koyasan. Koyasan is one of the major centers of basically Buddhist temples in Japan. And on TV and a lot of shows, you see people, they go to a Buddhist temple and they can stay the night there and they can basically act like a monk and eat like a monk. You get the vegetarian Buddhist food and that kind of stuff, and you can live the Buddhist life there. You can study Buddhism, things like that. And this is sort of one of the major places to do that in Japan. It's sort of important to book your stay at these types of places well in advance. But you can go and stay and, basically experience what it's like to live as a Buddhist monk without being a Buddhist monk yourself. So there's a lot of different temples at Koyasan, and there's this very large graveyard. So you see here part of the graveyard. This is just a small portion of it. And we'll talk more about festivals. But one of the important festivals here at this particular graveyard is it happens every year, and people come and they light 1,000 candles along the route of this graveyard. And that's just one of the types of examples of, festivals, ceremonies, events, rituals that can occur at shrines and temples throughout Japan that you may want to schedule your visit around. So we'll look at, pictures of those types of events as well for those of us who may never get there. So this is Yakushima. Yakushima is one of the southern islands, more heading down more towards Okinawa. It is one of the wettest places in the world. It is known for its ancient cedar trees and its, moss-covered everything. It's, the sort of aesthetic of Yakushima is said to have inspired the landscapes of Princess Mononoke, which was a movie that we watched during one of T-Fay's movie nights. So this is a famous place to come and hike and experience these ancient woods. So that's another thing we'll be talking about is these types of, natural sort of vacations that you can go on, and the, importance of these sites for the Japanese people. This is called a power spot, So obviously, when you go into the woods, for the Japanese people, it's not just going into the woods. It's, really a religious experience. Because this is where the gods live, this is where the power of the gods is located. So that's Yakushima. Moving on to Osaka. Osaka is another one of the major cities of Japan. I think the three most populous cities of Japan are Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe. Osaka, it was, a very busy port for many years, still is, and it is known for, its food. The city's motto basically translates as eat till you drop. So we'll talk about Osaka, the foods you'll find there, the sights and things like that, as well as Kobe. So it's not just Tokyo that we'll talk about. And we'll also talk about Shikoku. Shikoku is sort of it's like the smallest of the 4 main islands, and not a lot of people go there, not a lot of people live there. So if you wanted a more peaceful trip, it's an ideal place to go. There's a lot of very interesting gardens to go down there, and this is an example of a garden, and you can go on this traditional type of like boat ride through the garden. So there's a lot of interesting cultural and historical sites in Shikoku, but it's not as like hectic as some other areas. So if you wanted a quieter trip, this is the place to go. So we'll talk about Shikoku, and we'll talk about castles, of course. So we'll talk about, temples, shrines, all sorts of different things, and we get to castles. So castles are, of course, connected to various points in Japanese history that we'll talk about. Clans, important families, samurai, things like that. We'll touch upon all of that. This is the White Heron Castle, or Himijo. I'm going to butcher this because I always do. Himijijo. And you'll notice that like certain words get tacked on to the end of Japanese. Whenever something has jo tacked on to the end of it, that means it's a castle. And of course, not a lot of the old castles survive. For us today, we have a lot of reconstructed castles that you can visit, but this is actually one that actually survives. The base is stone, and then the top area you have, wood and stucco that survive. So we'll talk about the importance of these castles. Sometimes, you had temples or shrines, and then people would come along and be like, this is a really important location, as far as like military, this is a site that military institution should be on. So people would knock that stuff down and build a castle, and then you'd have these fortresses that were important during military history, and people would spend their time laying siege to each other's castles. So we'll talk about how the castles are created, castle architecture, how they're designed to, basically deter attackers and different things like that. We'll talk about the most important historical castles throughout Japan as well. And another major thing that we'll talk about is Matsuri. Matsuri are festivals. And there's a lot of different types of festivals throughout Japan. Some of them are more pop cultural, but a lot of them have their roots in, Shinto beliefs and Buddhist beliefs. So you'll have, Shinto festivals, Buddhist festivals. You'll also have community-based festivals. So we'll talk about a lot of those types of things. And especially, it's one of those things where oftentimes they only happen once a year. So if you're really interested in seeing a particular type of festival, you'll need to know when these things happen. This is Nara no Kenka Matsuri, and it is known as the Fighting Festival. So there's a variety of things that happen throughout this festival, but sort of the highlight is this battle of the shrines. So these are portable kami shrines. So oftentimes during the Matsuri festivals, the main section of the event is bringing the kami out of the shrines in these little portable shrines, and then they're paraded throughout the streets. So the kami get to see the town essentially during the festivals. And this is an example of like sort of the Fight Club version of that. So you had different shrines. You have groups of men from each shrine, basically supporting different kami, and then they slam these shrines against each other until one is on top of the other ones, basically. So you have this sort of like battle of the shrines to see who can win, and you can tell from the crowd of people how many people get involved in this. You can judge the scale of the shrines and how it's kind of a dangerous activity, but this is just one example of the many different types of festivals that we'll talk about throughout the presentations. Alright, so you're probably all asleep by now. But again, if there's anything I said that's wrong, feel free to correct me. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. If you can't hear me, let me know. If I became a jerky puppet, let me know. So basically, this was my sort of test intro and give you an idea of the types of things that we'll be talking about as the presentations continue. Alright. So if nobody has any questions or comments or anything, I think I've been talking way too long and you're probably all asleep. Hopefully Dapper did not start streaming while I was doing this. Hopefully not. Alright. Red Panda says thumbs up. Okay. Alright, so I will try my ending screen. Thank you guys for showing up. Thank you for listening, watching. Hope you were able to stay awake during it. So this will give you a taste of the rest of the stuff that I will talk about during my mini presentations, if I can continue this insanity. Thank you for showing up, and have a great night, everyone, or evening, or morning, or wherever you are. Bye-bye.